The road stretched endlessly before me, a jagged scar cutting through the wilderness. Tall pines loomed on either side, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the overcast sky. Ridgeway, Oregon, was just a few miles ahead, but the further I drove, the heavier the silence became. No birds, no rustling leaves, no signs of life. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my stomach knotting with unease. I had been to dying towns before, places where jobs dried up and people vanished overnight. But this was different. Ridgeway didn't just feel abandoned. It felt wrong. When I finally passed the wooden sign that read "Welcome to Ridgeway," half the letters were missing, and deep gashes ran through the wood, as if something with claws had tried to rip it apart. I swallowed hard and kept driving. The town was empty. Storefronts sat in eerie silence, their windows shattered, their doors swinging on broken hinges. A gas station stood at the corner, its sign flickering weakly, but no cars were parked at the pumps. A newspaper, yellowed and brittle, fluttered against the pavement, the headline barely legible, "For more missing." Authorities urged calm. I pulled up to the Ridgeway Motel, the only place still showing signs of operation. The neon vacancy sign buzzed above the entrance, the red letters barely glowing through the grime. I stepped out of my car, inhaling the thick scent of damp earth, and something else, something metallic. Blood? No, I was imagining things. Inside, the motel lobby was as lifeless as the streets. A small bell sat on the front desk, and when I tapped it, the sharp ding echoed too loudly in the empty space. A few seconds later, a hunched figure emerged from the back room. The woman looked ancient, her wrinkled skin stretched tight over her face. Her milky eyes locked onto me, unblinking. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. I forced a polite smile. "Just passing through." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, finally, she slid a key across the counter. "Room 6. Stay inside after dark." I hesitated. "What?" She just shook her head and turned away, vanishing into the shadows of the back room. I took the key and left, my skin prickling. Room 6 was at the far end of the lot. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dusty space with a single bed, a wooden desk, and a flickering lamp. The air smelled stale, like the room hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag on the bed and checked my phone. No service, no Wi-Fi, just the emptiness of a town that had been forgotten. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard it, a slow, dragging sound outside my window, like something heavy being pulled across the pavement. I held my breath and turned my head toward the curtains. A shadow moved just beyond the glass. I reached for my phone, but my fingers trembled. Another sound, a whisper, too faint to hear. Then, silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, but the noise never came back. When morning finally arrived, I stepped outside to find deep drag marks in the dirt, leading away from my window, and into the woods. The town felt wrong. Not just empty, not just abandoned, wrong. Like something had sunk its teeth into Ridgeway long ago and drained it dry, leaving only a husk of what used to be. I walked along Main Street as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. Storefronts were covered in dust, their windows either shattered or smeared with grime. A once busy diner stood lifeless, its neon sign flickering weakly, buzzing like an insect trapped in a light fixture. The only place that still had signs of life was Murphy's Bar, a small, dimly lit dive squeezed between a boarded-up hardware store and an old pawn shop. I stepped inside, and the scent of stale beer and damp wood greeted me. A few men sat hunched over their drinks, barely acknowledging my presence. A battered radio crackled behind the counter, playing a song that must have been decades old. The bartender, a man in his 60s with deep lines across his face, eyed me as he wiped down the counter. "You're new," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "Just passing through," I replied, taking a seat at the bar, looking into some things. He snorted. "Ain't much left to look into." I glanced around. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings and faded photographs of the town's better days. Trophies from long-forgotten baseball tournaments. Smiling faces frozen in time. None of them matched the town I was standing in now. "I heard a lot of people have gone missing around here," I said carefully. The bartender's hand paused mid-wipe. A couple of the men at the far end of the bar stiffened, but no one spoke. The air in the room changed, like I had just touched a wound that hadn't healed. "People leave," the bartender finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Town's dying. No jobs, no reason to stay." I shook my head. This isn't just people moving away. I read the reports. No warnings. No goodbyes. Just gone. One of the men at the end of the bar shifted uncomfortably. He was older, his hair thinning, his hands wrapped around his glass, as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. He muttered something under his breath. I turned toward him. "What was that?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone, or something, to walk through it. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "They don't leave." A chill crawled up my spine. The bartender shot him a glare. "Knock it off, Henry." Henry ignored him. He looked at me now, his eyes sunken and dark. "They take them," he said. "They come at night. You hear the footsteps. You hear them whispering outside your door." His voice dropped lower. "If you listen too long, you don't wake up the same." I leaned in. "Who takes them?" No one spoke. The bartender slammed a fresh glass onto the counter, making me flinch. "That's enough." Henry swallowed hard and turned back to his drink, his hands shaking. I exhaled, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. "Where do they go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The bartender didn't answer. Instead, he jerked his head toward the door. "If you're smart, you'll be gone by morning." I studied him, then the others. No one met my gaze. I pulled a few bills from my pocket, left them on the counter, and walked out. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees lining the street. The last bit of sunlight bled out of the sky, turning the town into a patchwork of shadows. I started toward my motel, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. And then I heard it. A soft, dragging sound. Somewhere behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned around. Nothing. The street was empty. I exhaled, shook my head, and kept walking. But this time I picked up my pace. I stepped into the apartment, the door creaking open like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust clung to the air, swirling in the dim light, filtering through the tattered curtains. The place smelled stale, like old books and something faintly metallic. This was my sister's last home, the last place she had been before she vanished. I moved slowly, scanning the room. A coffee cup sat abandoned on the kitchen counter, the liquid inside dried into a thick, black stain. Papers were scattered across the small wooden desk near the window, some crumpled, as if she had left in a hurry. But it was the bookshelf in the corner that caught my eye. Half of the books were pulled out slightly, uneven, like someone had been looking for something. I ran my fingers along the spines, stopping when I found an old leather notebook wedged between two thick medical texts. My breath hitched as I pulled it free. It was hers. I flipped open the cover, my heart pounding. The first few pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting. My sister's. June 7th. Something isn't right in this town. I've been hearing whispers about people disappearing, but no one wants to talk about it. The police shut down my questions fast. Said I should drop it. I won't. June 12th. More missing. No reports in the news. No police investigations. It's like these people never existed. I swallowed hard and turned the page. The handwriting became messy. The sentences rushed. June 15th. I followed a delivery truck tonight. It went to Ridgeway Memorial Hospital. That place has been shut down for years. No lights, no signs of life, except for the men unloading crates in the back. I got close enough to see a label. Neural Restoration Unit. What the hell is that? June 17th. I think I'm being watched. I stopped reading, suddenly aware of the silence pressing in around me. My fingers tightened around the book. I forced myself to keep going. June 19th. I heard something outside my window last night. Slow, shuffling footsteps. I thought it was just paranoia, but when I woke up, there were footprints in the dirt below. Bare footprints. I checked the locks 3 times today. June 20th. They know. I don't know how, but they know I've been digging. Someone was inside my apartment while I was out. My papers were moved. My laptop was wiped clean. I can't stay here. If something happens to me, tell Anthony. The entry stopped there. The rest of the page was torn, ripped clean from the spine. I flipped through the remaining pages, but they were all blank. A sudden noise made me freeze. A soft knock against the window. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The window was shut, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air outside. But there, pressed against the condensation, was the faint imprint of a hand. I wasn't alone. The hospital smelled like damp rot, and something worse, something I couldn't quite name. It clung to the air, thick and sour, as if the walls themselves had been steeped in death. Ridgeway Memorial had been abandoned for years, yet as I stepped inside, I felt like I was trespassing. The entrance lobby was in ruins. Ceiling tiles had crumbled to the floor, mixing with shattered glass and broken furniture. A wheelchair, rusted and missing one wheel, sat in the corner like someone had left in a hurry. I pulled out my flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing old posters curling on the walls. Health warnings, flu shots, faded smiling doctors, their eyes hollowed out by time. I took a deep breath and moved forward. My sister's journal had led me here. She had written about strange shipments arriving at the hospital after it was shut down. But why? My footsteps echoed as I walked down the hall. A faint tapping sound came from somewhere ahead. I froze, holding my breath. Silence. I told myself it was just the building settling, just water dripping from a leaky pipe. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. Past the lobby, I found a long corridor lined with examination rooms. The doors were ajar, revealing overturned beds and scattered medical tools. Dried blood darkened the tile floor in streaks and handprints. Then I saw the morgue sign. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself forward. The double doors creaked as I pushed them open. Inside, the room was cold, far colder than it should have been. The rows of metal storage drawers gleamed under my flashlight's beam. Some were sealed shut. Others hung open, revealing empty slabs. And then I saw them. Bodies. Dozens of them. Some lay on gurneys, covered in brittle white sheets. Others rested against the walls, stacked like forgotten mannequins. Their skin was pale, tinged with gray and green. Their eyes, if they had any left, were clouded and sunken. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a dumping ground. Then, one of the bodies moved. A small twitch, almost imperceptible. A hand, curling slightly. I stopped breathing. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against my chest. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was just a muscle reflex. Maybe decomposition did things I didn't understand. But then another one moved. A soft, jerky shift of a shoulder. A sound filled the room. A faint, wet groan. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my grip. One of the bodies sat up, its head tilted in a slow, unnatural motion, as if testing the limits of its neck. Its mouth hung slightly open, lips dry and cracked. The skin around its jaw was torn, revealing dark, rotting flesh beneath. Then, it turned its head toward me. I saw its eyes. They weren't blank. They weren't dead. They were aware. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran. My boots pounded against the floor, my breath ragged and loud in my ears. Behind me, I heard the sound of metal scraping, the slow shuffling of movement. I burst through the morgue doors, nearly slipping on the blood-stained tiles. I turned down the hall, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the walls. The tapping sound returned, but now it was closer. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. I just ran, pushing myself forward, lungs burning. The exit was ahead, so close I could see the flickering green glow of the emergency sign. Something growled behind me, a wet, rattling sound that sent ice down my spine. I shoved through the doors and into the night, nearly collapsing onto the cracked pavement outside. The cold air hit my face, shocking my lungs. I spun around, panting. The hospital door stood still, swaying slightly in the wind. The night was silent again, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew one thing for certain. The dead were not resting in Ridgeway. I ran. The air was thick with the scent of rot and damp earth, and my legs burned as I pushed forward, crashing through the overgrown streets of Ridgeway. Behind me, something was moving, something that should have been dead. I didn't dare look back. My breath came in ragged gasps. The town had felt abandoned before, but now it felt alive in the worst possible way. Shadows shifted between buildings. The night air was filled with faint, guttural murmurs. I wasn't imagining it. They were watching me. I turned a corner, nearly losing my footing on the cracked pavement. A rusted-out pickup truck sat in the middle of the road, its doors hanging open. Useless. Everything here was useless. My mind raced for a plan, but all I could think about was how cold the air had become. It pressed against my skin, thick and unnatural, like something breathing against the back of my neck. Then movement. A flash of something pale in the alleyway to my left. I stumbled to a stop. My body screamed for me to keep running, but my instincts told me something else. Someone was there. Not one of them. Something different. Inside, a voice hissed. I barely saw the hand that grabbed my wrist, yanking me into the darkness before I could react. The world spun as I was dragged through a doorway, and then, slam. The door shut. Silence. For a second, I only heard my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then a faint shuffle outside. The low, wet sound of something dragging itself along the pavement. I held my breath. The voice spoke again. Low. Urgent. Don't move. I obeyed. Minutes passed. Maybe seconds. Time stretched and blurred in the pitch-black room. Then, after what felt like forever, the sounds outside faded. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. I turned, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow of an oil lamp in the corner. That's when I finally saw him. The man was thin, almost skeletal, with wild, sunken eyes. His hair, once blonde, had gone mostly gray, and his hands twitched as he fumbled with the lamp. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks, maybe months. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the window, peering through a slit in the boarded-up glass. Only when he was satisfied did he turn to face me. Elliot, he muttered. You're Anthony Clark, aren't you? My body tensed. How do you know my name? He exhaled sharply. Because I knew your sister. The room felt colder. You knew Sarah? Elliot nodded, rubbing a trembling hand over his face. She came to me before she disappeared. She figured out what was really happening here. But she got too close, and then he trailed off, shaking his head. I tried to warn her. Just like I'm warning you now. You shouldn't have come here. My throat tightened. What happened to her? He hesitated. I don't know for sure. But if I had to guess, Silva got to her. Silva. The name sent a chill through me. I had seen it in Sarah's journal, scrawled over and over in the margins. Dr. Silva Moreno, the woman at the center of whatever nightmare this was. Elliot moved to a cluttered desk, pushing aside stacks of paper, old photographs, and vials filled with something thick and black. I worked with her once. Years ago, before everything went wrong. His voice turned bitter. She was brilliant. Obsessed. She wanted to cheat death. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? Elliot looked up, his eyes hollow. She didn't just bring the dead back. She made them think. Silence. The words settled like a weight in my chest. What are you talking about? I finally managed. He gestured toward a series of old monitors stacked against the wall. Static flickered across the screens, but as he twisted a dial, grainy footage appeared. My stomach clenched as I recognized what I was looking at. A dark room, hospital beds, and figures strapped down under dim, buzzing lights. Then one of them moved. Not the slow, clumsy movement of a mindless corpse. This was different. Precise. Deliberate. The figure turned its head toward the camera, eyes dull but focused. Then its lips moved. The sound cut out, but I could see the words forming. Help me. The footage ended. The screen went dark. I turned to Elliot, my pulse hammering. That's what Silva created, he said. Not just zombies. Something worse. I was getting closer. I didn't know how I knew it, but the feeling gnawed at me, tightening like a noose around my chest. My instincts, usually sharp, felt like they were blurring the deeper I ventured. I'd been following the breadcrumbs, my sister's journal, the cryptic warnings, the bodies I couldn't explain. But now, it wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was real, and it was hunting me. The trees around me were still, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The path ahead was barely visible, swallowed by an eerie mist that hung low to the ground, giving everything a ghostly tint. My boots crunched over twigs, each sound too loud for comfort. The air was thick with the smell of decay, faint but unmistakable, like something that had been buried for far too long. I finally saw it. A rusted steel door, half hidden by overgrown ivy and moss. It wasn't marked, but the cold, sterile look of it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew this was the place. The hidden lab that had been conducting things they shouldn't. The place where all this madness began. I pulled the door open, and it creaked, loud as a scream in the quiet. Inside was a far cry from the woods. It was dark, too dark, and the air tasted stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The flicker of weak fluorescent lights above me barely held back the darkness that tried to swallow everything. I stepped inside, my feet muffled by the dust on the floor. The place smelled wrong. It wasn't just the damp, it was something else, a metallic, chemical tang that burned my throat with each breath. The hall ahead stretched endlessly, lined with rooms on either side. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Proof, answers, anything. But I was already beginning to regret my decision. I should have turned back the second I saw the door. But I didn't. I had to know what happened to my sister. I had to know the truth, even if it scared me more than anything else in my life. I crept down the corridor, my footsteps slow, deliberate. Each room I passed seemed locked, or maybe abandoned. The walls were lined with cold, stainless steel counters, long empty shelves, and rusting machines. But the more I looked, the more I noticed something off. Some of the equipment looked new. Too new, considering the state of the rest of the place. It was as though someone was still working here. Or at least, someone had been until recently. Then I heard it. A soft noise. A rustle, like fabric brushing against something hard. The kind of sound you don't notice at first, but then it makes your skin crawl. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something alive. I pressed myself against the wall, peering around the corner. The hallway stretched longer than I expected, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. But at the far end of it, I saw a door cracked open just enough to let a faint light spill through. I couldn't ignore it. My legs moved before I could stop them, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the door. I pushed it open. What I saw inside made my stomach drop. It was like something out of a nightmare. A room full of restraints, hooked up to monitors, for lines snaking into the walls. But it wasn't the equipment that stopped me cold. It was what was lying on the gurney in the center of the room. A body. Or at least, it looked like a body. Pale, unmoving, except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. But there was something wrong with it. Something unnatural. The skin, though it was still soft, looked too perfect, too smooth. Like it hadn't aged a day. But there were other signs. The fingers, curled into claws. The mouth, slightly ajar, too wide for comfort. And the eyes, those hollow, empty eyes that were too open. I stepped closer, but the hairs on my neck stood straight up when I noticed something else. The room wasn't empty. Along the walls, behind rows of cabinets, were more bodies. Dozens of them. Some of them weren't bodies at all. They were moving. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I thought I'd seen enough, but I hadn't. Not by a long shot. They weren't just dead. They were twitching, shifting, as though they were waking from a long slumber. There was a man, his chest open, a mess of wires and tubes connected to his torso. His eyes flickered, and I could have sworn he saw me. Then there was a woman, her mouth stretched open in a scream that never quite left her lips. Her head turned toward me slowly, impossibly slow, and her eyes locked with mine. I couldn't breathe. I turned, ready to bolt, but that's when I heard it. The voice. A woman's voice, calm and methodical, coming from the shadows of the far corner. "You shouldn't be here," she said. The voice was so eerily calm it made my skin crawl. "But now that you are, you should understand." I didn't even need to see her face. I knew who it was. Silva. Dr. Silva Moreno. She stepped out from the darkness, the harsh fluorescent light casting long shadows across her face. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp, with the kind of coldness that could freeze you in place. And her lips, curled into the slightest of smiles, spoke a truth I wasn't ready for. "You're wondering what this all is. What I've done. You're wondering why they're still here. Why they move. The truth is simple, really. I've given them life. And they're learning. They're evolving." I felt the weight of her words settle on me like a stone, but I couldn't look away. "You've seen enough," she said, her smile widening. "But there's so much more to see, Anthony. So much more." And then, as if the room itself had decided to join her in the madness, the bodies started moving. All of them. They looked at me. I turned to run. I should have known. Something deep inside me, something primal, had been screaming to turn around, to leave, to get the hell out of that place before it was too late. But I didn't. I pressed on, through the narrow, flickering hallways of the underground bunker. The walls were cold, damp with the smell of rust and decay. The soft hum of electricity and the distant sounds of things moving in the dark only made the silence heavier, suffocating. And then I saw her. Dr. Silva Moreno stood at the end of the hall, as if she'd been waiting for me the entire time. Her lab coat was pristine, unblemished by the horrors surrounding her. She didn't look surprised to see me, but then again, she probably knew I'd come sooner or later. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said, her voice smooth, almost soothing. She spoke like a teacher addressing a curious student. Calm, collected, yet there was an edge to it. I couldn't place it at first, but made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Neither were you." I shot back, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. I was trying to be brave, to show that I wasn't afraid, but I knew I was lying. She took a step forward, her eyes glinting with a cold intelligence that felt too sharp for comfort. "You're more of an obstacle than you realize, Annie. But I think you'll understand soon enough." I gritted my teeth. "Understand what? That you're playing God with people's lives? That you've turned death into a science experiment?" She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel safe. It was more of a smirk, like she knew a secret that I didn't. "You think it's about the dead?" "No, Anthony. It's not about the dead at all. It's about what we can do with them. You see, death is just a process, a phase, a temporary halt. I'm merely extending it. I'm enhancing it." I shook my head, feeling a cold dread start to creep over me. "You can't just—" I stopped myself, not knowing how to finish the sentence. "You can't just make zombies. You can't play with the essence of life and death and expect it to work out." But she wasn't listening to me anymore. Silva's eyes drifted to the monitor beside her, where a grainy video was playing, footage of one of the reanimated bodies. But this wasn't like the mindless ghouls you see in movies. This one was different. The thing in the video was aware. It blinked, tilting its head as if it was recognizing someone, as if it was trying to remember. "No," I whispered, stepping closer to the screen. "This isn't possible." "Oh, but it is," she said, stepping beside me. "This is just the beginning, Anthony. You have no idea what I've unlocked. The human brain has so much more potential than we've ever realized. These bodies, they're not just walking around with empty eyes. No, they think, they learn, and soon, they will evolve." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought I understood the horror of what was happening, but this was something else entirely. These weren't just the shambling, mindless creatures I'd imagined. They were thinking. She smiled again, her lips curling slightly. "I suppose I should explain it to you, seeing as you're so eager to understand. The technology we've developed, it allows the dead to return, but it also keeps a part of their mind alive. And as they adapt, they evolve, they become something greater, something better. And when they're ready, they'll no longer be the victims of death. They'll be the masters." I felt a sickening jolt in my chest. I could barely breathe. You've created a new kind of life." "No," she said softly. "I've created a new kind of humanity. But you wouldn't understand. Not yet." I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. She wasn't just obsessed with power. She believed in it. She thought this was her destiny. She thought she had unlocked the key to something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. I stepped back, but she just stood there, unmoving. "I already have," she replied, her voice like ice. "You've already seen them. They're more than just experiments now, Annie. They're the future." And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps behind me. My heart raced, and I spun around, only to find myself face to face with a group of them. The undead. But not like before. These were different. They moved with purpose. They weren't stumbling or groaning mindlessly. They were watching me. And for a split second, I could have sworn I saw one of them, its eyes locking with mine, recognize me. It wasn't just a reflection of hunger or death in those eyes. There was something more there. Something unsettlingly human. Dr. Silva stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a sick sort of pride. "You see? They're no longer the mindless husks you thought they were. They think, Anthony. They understand. And soon, they'll surpass all of us." The door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. And for the first time since I'd come here, I realized just how much danger I was in. These things, these creatures, they weren't just threats to my life. They were a threat to everything we knew about what it meant to be human. I didn't know how much time I had before they would come for me. But I was going to have to find out. Because if Silva was right, the world I once knew was already dead. The whole building seemed to groan, like it was waking up from a nightmare. The walls shuddered, and the lights flickered. I had no idea what I'd just done. The moment I hit that button, the alarms blared to life, sending a screeching noise through the facility. Red lights flashed, the warning signs screamed at me. Evacuate immediately. Lockdown in progress. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The ground trembled beneath my feet. For a second, I thought I was losing my balance, but the truth sank in faster than my own heartbeat. It wasn't me. It was the facility. The entire place was shaking like it was going to collapse around me. I ran. I didn't know where to, but it didn't matter. There were only two options now: move or die. My feet pounded against the steel floor as I tore down the hallway. My head spun with fear, with disbelief. I destroyed the only thing that was keeping those things, locked away. And now they were coming. I barely made it to the main lab door when the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor echoed behind me. I spun around, breath catching in my throat. For a second, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but no. There it was, one of them. It was a man once. He had been. I could still make out the shape of his face, but it was twisted, like a bad reflection in water. His skin hung loose, like it had been stretched too thin, and his eyes, those eyes, were wide open. Not dead, but not alive either. He moved toward me, dragging his left leg as though it no longer knew how to work. And then I saw it. The thing that made my stomach churn and my heart stutter. He was thinking. I could see it in his eyes. I didn't wait to confirm. I turned and ran again, my pulse loud in my ears. I needed to get to the emergency exit, but I knew that was a joke. There was no escaping this. Not now. The facility's lockdown was just the beginning. The sound of footsteps came from every direction. More of them. Dozens of them. They were coming. And they were aware. The things I had only read about in those reports. This wasn't some mindless horde. They were watching me. And they were waiting. I slammed into the emergency lab door, but it didn't budge. Panic surged in my chest. I pushed harder, my hands slick with sweat, trying not to look over my shoulder, knowing they were gaining on me. Finally, the door gave way, and I fell forward, hitting the cold floor with a loud thud. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. The lab was dimly lit, its walls lined with metal shelves cluttered with half-finished experiments, old medical equipment, and faded, yellowed papers. I had no idea where to go next, so I just kept moving, looking for anything that could help me survive, that could buy me even a few extra seconds. The sound of scratching feet and low, guttural groans filled the hallway just outside the door. I pressed myself into the corner, my heart beating so fast I was sure they could hear it. I held my breath, hoping to God they hadn't already tracked me in here. But the door creaked open, slowly, the hinges whining under the pressure. And then I heard it, the voice, the one I never thought I'd hear again. "Do you think this is the end, Anthony?" Dr. Silva's voice was cold, too calm. I turned to find her standing there, her figure lit up in the dim light of the lab. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes locked on mine. She was unbothered by the chaos surrounding us. She was controlling it. "You were never supposed to see this," she continued, stepping closer. "But now that you have, you can understand the beauty of it all. The evolution of the human mind, beyond death." I could barely hear her over the sound of the footsteps coming closer. I turned, desperation sinking into my bones. But it was too late. They were here. The undead. Only, they weren't just zombies. They were something more. Something alive, trapped inside decaying flesh. The first one lunged at me, its mouth snapping open, the stench of death in the air. I dodged, stumbling back, but it was already too late. More were coming, and they weren't just going to kill me. They were going to learn from me. I lunged toward the nearest table, grabbing a scalpel. It was nothing. A joke, really, but it was all I had left. I raised it just in time to stab the nearest zombie in the throat, but another grabbed me from behind, dragging me to the ground. I screamed. The world went black for a second as I fought to breathe. But then I heard something snap. The sound of the undead crashing through the walls and ripping apart Dr. Silva's lab. She screamed as they dragged her into the darkness. I barely saw her face, but the terror in her eyes was enough to tell me she never expected this. Not in a million years. But I wasn't out of the woods yet. I pushed myself up, using the table to steady myself, gasping for air. The ground beneath me was already slick with blood, both fresh and old, mixing together into a grotesque pool. I had to move, but my legs were shaking too hard to trust. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that the way out was no longer a choice. It was survival. I didn't stop running until the lights went out. I thought I'd escaped. The sound of the facility collapsing behind me, those groans, the crash of concrete and metal, faded into the distance as I ran. But even then, I knew the truth. The worst wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I made my way back to the town, stepping carefully through the tangled mess of broken wood and shattered glass. The streets eerily quiet. The fog had thickened, rolling in like some kind of living thing, choking out the last remnants of light. It was like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I found what I came for, proof. There was no denying what Dr. Silva had done. I had the files, the video logs, the research notes. I had everything I needed to expose her, her experiments, her twisted justifications, the horrors she unleashed on this godforsaken town. Everything was in my hands. I thought that was enough. I thought the truth would be the key to stopping it. But the longer I stood there, the more I began to feel something else. A chill running up my spine. A strange sense of wrongness, as if the world had shifted beneath my feet and I hadn't noticed. The air felt thick with something I couldn't quite name, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Maybe it was just the weight of what I'd seen. Maybe it was the exhaustion settling in. I couldn't tell anymore. I went back to the old motel where I'd been staying. The room was still the same, dim, with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked with every movement. It didn't feel like a place for sleep. It felt like a tomb. I sat down at the desk, the only source of light in the room coming from the flickering lamp overhead. I plugged in my laptop, the same one I'd used to gather all the evidence. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I stared at the screen. The video files were there, ready to be uploaded. I could do it now, expose everything to the world. I could make sure the truth came out, make sure that what Silva did wasn't just swept under the rug. I'd end it. I'd stop her, even if she was already dead. But when I looked at the files, when I really looked at them, I hesitated. Was I really going to upload this? Was I prepared for what would happen once I did? The government would want to silence me. They'd come after me. They'd bury it all. Maybe they already had. I exhaled sharply, my breath a cloud in the cold room. I clicked the upload button, watching as the files began to transfer. It wasn't just a matter of exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival. This was my shot. If I didn't act now, the world would never know. I watched the progress bar crawl forward, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. The minutes felt like hours. Every noise outside the room made me jump, my eyes darting to the window. The town felt wrong. Empty. Lifeless. And yet, not. Finally, the bar reached 100%. The files were uploaded. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. I just felt empty. The adrenaline from the escape, the fear, the anticipation, it all drained out of me, leaving nothing but a hollow ache in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the fatigue that had settled into my bones. And that's when I saw it. I was so focused on the screen that I didn't notice at first. It was in the reflection of the window, the faintest shift in the glass. I froze, my blood running cold. The fog outside, the pale light. It wasn't enough to make the reflection clear, but something about it was wrong. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the room. Nothing. The room was the same. The dark corners, the empty walls, the quiet hum of the motel's outdated air conditioner. But when I looked back at the screen, that's when I saw it again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. My reflection didn't look quite right. My eyes. Something was different about them. At first, I thought it was just the light, the shadows playing tricks. But as I leaned in closer to the screen, I realized I was wrong. My pupils, they were too wide, too dark. There was something almost otherworldly about them. My heart slammed against my chest. I couldn't look away. I reached up instinctively to touch my face, my fingers trembling. But the moment my hand came close, I stopped. It wasn't just the eyes. It was the feeling. Something deep inside me told me that I wasn't alone in my skin anymore. I stood up quickly, knocking over the chair in my haste. My breath was coming fast now, short, sharp gasps as I stumbled back toward the door. The world was spinning. Everything was wrong. The weight in the air pressed harder on my chest, as if something invisible was wrapping around me, tightening. I yanked open the door and stumbled into the hallway. But the moment I stepped out, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the hallway, was a figure. Tall, pale, shuffling slowly toward me with that same unnerving, predatory gait. The figure didn't belong here. It shouldn't be moving, shouldn't be awake. My mind went blank for a second. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor as the figure came closer, its hollow eyes locked on me. And then I heard a voice, my own voice, but twisted, low, a whisper in the back of my mind. You thought you escaped. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop to think about what was chasing me, or whether I was imagining things. I ran. But even as I pushed myself harder, faster, something inside me whispered that it was too late. I was already part of it, and I didn't know how long I had before it was all over.